Babe, society around us has a lot to say about sex. And really, most of it is not only wrong, but it's destructive to who we are as human beings.
Well, let's get into that. Hi, I'm Andrea Warnock.
I'm Nathan Warnock.
And you've joined us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. And this is a time where we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what we see in the Bible as to his design and what he sets out, what he wants from us in marriage, and then how we live that out practically.
That's right. So you've caught us in the midst of a series about sex. Sex is something that comes up with at pretty much every marital and most premarital couples that we have an opportunity to meet with. And it's something that over a period of time in this country has been sort of gradually given over to the world to define, to set the terms of, to talk about. And it's time for us as Christians and as Bible-believing men and women to take back sex. Because sex is something that God created. He created it right from the beginning of when man and woman were here together. And it's really, frankly, a shame that we ever gave it up. And it's time for us to take back the high ground on who gets to define sex. And that's not me. It's not you. It's God, in His Word. So that's what we're talking about. So today specifically, we're going to be talking about what we put together as sort of the top 5 ways that the world around us is missing it with regards to the purpose and meaning of sex, and why that's problematic, really, for us as married couples. If you're watching this as a dating couple or an engaged couple, certainly as a single person, society around you is trying really hard to tell you what sex is and what it isn't, how you should handle your sexuality, what's beautiful, what's not beautiful, and very little of it lines up with God's design for sex.
Right.
So this particular episode is not about what God's design for sex is. That will certainly be there as a backdrop, but because it's a backdrop, if you've not watched last week's episode where we talk about what is sex and God's design for it biblically, that's foundational to our conversation today. So I would really encourage you, please go back 1 week and listen to that episode. I'll link to it right up here in the corner of our podcast, so you can just click that if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening, just click out of this episode and go back 1 week and listen to that episode first. I'm really proud of the way that we handled that and feel really blessed because I just felt like the Holy Spirit really had a plan for what he wanted to convey last week, and Lord willing, we were able to get out of the way and just convey that message. So please go back and listen to that. So with that background, if you've watched last week's show, you know that one of the big things that we talked about is that sex is a threefold act. It's a physical act, an emotional act, and a spiritual act. And it was created that way for a specific purpose. So with that backdrop, and I suppose we should always start every episode about sex by saying, we in the Marriage by Design podcast, and as representatives telling you that we take the Bible literally and we've studied the Bible and all that it has to say about sex, which is a lot, we believe that God's clear intention for sex was that it's between one man and one woman within the bounds of covenant marriage for their lifetime.
Right, yep.
Now, within that playground, there's a lot of latitude.
Yeah,
that
lots
the
of
Bible
open doors.
gives. And we're going to talk about that next week. Is going to be our episode where we talk about, okay, what's okay and not okay. I'll leave you just with this teaser. The Bible addresses oral sex directly.
Yep.
And we will read that passage and go from there. So if you have questions about, hey, are my spouse and I, what can and can't we do? love for you to join us next week. So there's that. Probably also with that lead in, this is one of those few shows where we want to give the disclaimer that if you have young people around, your kids around while you're listening to this, if you throw it up on Alexa or Google Home or whatever, just beware that we address sex directly. We don't talk about it in euphemisms, and this will go all the more next week because we'll address some pretty, hopefully reverently, but we're going to address all the stuff.
Specifics, right.
And same a little bit with today. So just beware of that and may want to listen to this when they're in bed. So anyway, there you go. All right, so let's test our head. Let's talk about these top 5 that we put together. So they're not necessarily in any particular order, but the first one that I believe is prevalent in the society around us. And when I say society around us, I don't just mean American society. I don't just mean Christian society. I mean the whole of Western society.
Western culture, yep.
And unfortunately, oftentimes that includes the church, not excludes the church. Meaning a lot of these myths I feel like people within the Christian community get caught up in just as much as those outside the Christian community.
Sure.
So, and this first one is no exception to that. So the first way that I believe society gets sex wrong is by making sex trivial. Meaning not sacred and important, right? Trivial is like common, throwaway, right? It's not a big deal because it's, everywhere around us. It's not something that requires a lot of thought and or intention. It's trivial, right? And so what do I mean by this? Well, first and foremost, you really, again, if you haven't listened to last week's show, you really got to start there because that lays the foundation of how not trivial sex was designed to be.
Right. The importance of it, why it represents more than just sex.
Right.
It represents really God and his relationship with us as believers. And God made it so that it's not just a physical act. It's a spiritual act. It's an emotional act. And there's so much more to it than just what goes where. Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so as we look at sex, I want to just take, and there's probably hundreds of verses I could have pointed us to about sex. I mean, interestingly, even if you go to the prophets, you learn a lot about sex because the prophets were relaying God's message of judgment to the Israelites, but God uses some pretty sexual language when he talks about the idolatry that the Israelites entered into. And, I mean, there's a passage in Ezekiel where he calls the Israelites whores like 20-something times because of their idolatry and infidelity to him as their God. So, but the one we're going to go to is right in the beginning. If you flip your Bibles to Genesis 2, it's going to be the very end of Genesis 2. It's right after God has created Eve from Adam. Adam wakes up from being put to sleep by God, looks at Eve, and definitely did not yawn, and named her woman. Because she was taken out of man. And the Bible says, starting in verse 24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and the wife were both naked, and
they were not ashamed."
There's a lot to learn from just those couple of verses, right? So God says a man will leave his father and mother and pursue intimacy with his wife. There's something to be learned there, right? Our wives, if you haven't learned this yet, our wives are not necessarily made that we just shoot them a text when we're ready for sex and they hustle right over. We're designed to pursue that.
Or if that's the method you're using, it might not be working very well.
Right. Yeah, we're designed to pursue that. The man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. I mean, hold fast to his. Do I need to go into detail on that? And they shall become one flesh, right? And as we talked last week, that doesn't just mean sexual, but it does mean sexual.
Yes.
So see, one of the ways in the church that we get this wrong is we try to take all of these verses like that one and go, well, that's just, that doesn't mean sex. Right? That's just men reading it and they think about sex all the time. Which is partially true, but we'll get to that in a minute. But it does also mean sex.
Become one in every way.
All the ways.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And so to trivialize this act that God created that's really a part of the very first sentence God ever says about sex, or God ever says about marriage, implies sex and becoming one. That's not a trivial thing. Right? I mean, he doesn't say, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and create budgets and make sure that they both have decent jobs and aren't taking out a mortgage that's bigger than they can afford. None of those things are mentioned here. Even though those are all critical things to a marriage, right? Your finances have to be on point. You have to be on the same page with parenting and with working and role responsibilities and all those things. And praise the Lord that you do have to be on point with all those things, or we wouldn't have much to talk about on this channel. But in this particular sentence, God goes, hey, here's marriage and sex. That's what I got for you. And he gives it to Adam and Eve. And it's not coincidental then that the next section says, and also they were both naked.
And unashamed,
right.
Yeah.
Right. See, we get as far as like the man and his wife were both naked and then all the guys get distracted. Right? And we forget and they were unashamed. There wasn't any shame in the sexuality of their relationship. It was the two of them, each other getting lost in each other's bodies and in each other's relationships and in the beauty of the nakedness of the two of them, but there wasn't any shame in that. So one of the challenges that I really want to leave us with is the things that the world is telling you about sex. What does that leave you with? Because God has a plan for sex, and his plan for sex is that you're both naked and unashamed. And by the way, that's not just his plan for sex, that's also his plan for the intimacy, emotional intimacy in your relationship, for the spiritual intimacy in your relationship, for your spiritual intimacy with the Lord. So these myths that society around tells us about sex, does that leave you closer or further away from being naked and unashamed?
Yeah.
And I think when we think about it that way, it becomes really clear that we're being duped by what society around us says is good for our sexuality and good for our bodies. So how did sex become trivial? Well, one of the biggest reasons and ways for me started and ended with porn.
Yeah.
When we started, and I'm not talking about that newfangled internets, right? I mean, I'm saying the Corinthians in biblical times struggled this area.
There was pornography dating way back to
totally.
Almost the beginning of time.
Yeah, go back and read about the temple to Artemis and the temple of Zeus.
Yeah, this is not a new thing.
You know, there were women in Corinth specifically who were owned by the temple who would go around and do seductive dances and engage in stripping and showing off the goods to people walking by, specifically for the sales pitch of coming into the temple and paying money to have sex with them, and that money would then go to the coffers of the temple.
Right.
I mean, the only thing we're missing now is that, so-and-so gentleman's club isn't called the Temple of Zeus anymore. It's the same thing. And Paul addressed that with the Corinthians, and he calls them to a higher standard of sexuality. Yep. Well, that's the same all through the ages. The difference, though, is now the secret access that people have to pornography makes it easier to get hooked into a lifestyle of pornography. And even more so than just, here's a woman flashing her breasts at me, the things that you can access on the internet now take the act of sex and pervert it from the standpoint of defining what are good and bad sex acts. And I mean, if you join us back next week, I'm not even saying within marriage necessarily that a lot of those things are out of bounds within the context of your marriage.
Yeah.
But my point is, they make it so that like it plays into another item we're going to talk about in a minute, which is that, you know, marital sex is boring, right? Because you can't do all this crazy stuff that you can access online once you're married, which is one, a false premise, two, not correct, and three, again, trivializes the act of marriage within the context that we're supposed to have it in. So
Yeah, the act of sex.
right
Within the
so
context.
within the context of marriage, right?
Yeah.
So porn driven, number one. So there's a 3-part piece to that: porn driven, pornography driven, multimedia adopted, and then social media infused. All of those things tie together to trivialize sex in the modern society. So pornography driven, we've covered that. At some point, multimedia, and by that I mean magazines, television, Netflix, Amazon Prime, all the rest, they came to a realization that if we want to create a show or a movie and we want to draw in some extra people, maybe we can get this actress to do a scene without her shirt on. Or this guy crawls out of bed and shoot, we missed the camera by just enough that everybody gets to see his junk for half a second before he gets off the screen. Right? It's these little pieces of pornography that crossed over into normal television
Non-porn
and
things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so what happens when multimedia, when all these people adopt it, it takes pornography from a fringe sort of shameful thing to a mainstream thing.
Sort of goes into what we were talking about in our Sunday Night Live yesterday with compromise. You know, it's this small creep
Right.
that then ends up in big issues.
That's right. And to finish that thought off, because you're exactly right, then it went, once it was okay in television and movies, then it made the leap over into social media and or I'll include texting in that same context, right? It became okay to put a picture up with a super low-cut shirt and claim that, right? It wasn't like a picture of just some... It was like, hey, look at me. This is who I am.
I mean, back when we were younger, even the billboards you see out driving were never what they are now.
Oh, yeah.
And you see some really shocking billboards sometimes.
Right.
And even the things on just everywhere. The things everywhere.
That's right.
Were never, back when we were growing up, what they are now. And I'm sure our parents would say, when you were growing up, the things that you were seeing were so much more risque than what we were seeing.
Well, that raises up a reality, which is that the things that are accepted by this generation will be embraced by the next generation. And the problem with that is that an entire generation of young people grew up where, shoot, every movie I watch, somebody's having sex with somebody and they show it, or, you know, you can see this girl going down on this guy or these two guys hooking up or whatever the case may be. And it, in their minds, it created this idea that sex is just... It's just a thing that you just casually do. Yeah. It's trivial. And so then we go, man, can you believe the number of high school kids that are sending sexually explicit pictures to each other? I just can't even understand that. Well, I'm sorry, then you're not paying attention.
Right. Because it's just part of life.
That's right. It's trivial to them. And when you sit there and go, well, man, I'd have never done that when I was in high school. Well, think about why that is. Because you weren't seeing it all the time. Pick any of the Amazon shows, and Amazon in particular, and Netflix is right there with them. Any Amazon Prime original show, you're seeing boobs and butt in that show. Guaranteed. It's just a question of how much. Right? Guaranteed. And how many kids have Rokus or whatever on TVs that they have in their room? And then the parents go, well, yeah, but I gotta their internet's locked down so they can't access that stuff. Well, the problem is Satan's come in the other door because they're watching shows that have that stuff in them, and it's just like, it's just what you do, right? You just turn on Amazon and look at women. Well, I flip open my phone and I see pictures of girls from high school.
Yep.
It trivializes the act of sex, and it's got to stop because it's completely spiraling that generation, the current high school and middle school generation, down a road of depression and depravity that is going to shock you. And it's only a matter of time before some of those people look back at us and go, thanks for caring about what was going on with me. All right, so number 1, that sex is trivial. Number 2, that your identity is wrapped up in sex. And here's what I mean by that. That our identity as people is defined, not entirely, but largely by 3 questions. And I don't mean this to be graphic, it just is what it is. But the questions are who you do, what you do, and how you do it. Mm-hmm. Those 3 questions. And what I mean by that is look around, right? There's an entire constantly trending piece of TikTok that is all about your gender and sexual identity and what your preferred pronouns are and all that stuff. And if you think gender doesn't have anything to do with sex, you're fooling yourself. Yeah. It has everything to do with sex.
I mean, we see it everywhere, the whole gender identity thing.
Right, sexual
not just
identity.
TikTok, but
yeah, that's right.
Everywhere.
Right, right.
The children's museum and somebody's wearing a button saying she, her, hers.
Right.
Right. Like, as if it's always a question that we should be wondering about somebody.
Right.
Is their identity, their sexual identity.
That's right. That's right. And of course, the gender and sexual identity pieces are tied together. I mean, that's a foundational issue of humanity is, are you a man or are you a woman? And praise the Lord that he didn't leave us guessing. He put some pretty obvious plumbing in place so that we would know.
It's the first thing you know when they come.
What you got?
It's nearly the first thing you know once that baby comes out.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's the who you do piece. What you do. There's a whole cultural part of different sex acts, right? And we don't necessarily need to go into detail on this at all. But the point is that there are tons of times when you have conversations with someone that's like, oh, this one girl that I'm in, she did this and this and this, and this one guy, he was amazing at this, and it creates this idea of your identity is what you're willing to do, right? And
how good you are at it.
Yeah, you got to hook up with redheads because they're crazy in bed. Right, or whatever. You might listen to this stuff and think, well, this is stupid. But I mean, these are real things that people say. Now, they might say tongue in cheek, but this is one of my points of society is that's how society changes what people think about sex. It's not by mandate, right? But when you take a certain thing and you infuse it into conversation in society, people around start paying attention to that thing. Mm-hmm. So an example of that is that this and the how you do it is, I mean, look at how many times do we have to hear about, who's got a bigger penis or, bigger boobs or who's better in bed or whatever the things are. And it creates my body's just better than those other people's bodies. And it becomes your identity that one of the things you're good at is sex.
Yeah, and if you go back to last week's episode, this ties in with some of what we talked about. If we would keep sex the way God intended, when a guy and a lady get married, they would not even know that a bigger, a different penis size makes any sort of difference, or that they should be doing something any different way,
right?
Or that this could be better, or this isn't good, or is good,
right?
Other than just having those experiences with each other and talking with each other, and that's the unashamed part. Is there's nothing to compare this to, and there's no barometer other than this feels good. I like that. I feel connected to you with that or whatever. Let's explore this.
Didn't love that as much.
How exciting would that be if you had you have no comparison and you have no shame in a sexual relationship within your marriage because you've never had experiences outside of each other, and you have you have nothing other than the knowledge of each other.
Right.
And
that's right.
And saying we're open with each other, so let's just figure out what we like and what connects us, and we have our whole lives to do that.
Right, which means we have to come back to the question we asked at the beginning. The way sex is defined currently as you need to be good at it, you need to be properly equipped for it, you need to be doing it with the right people. Does that make it more likely or less likely to reach a naked and unashamed position with any person?
Yeah.
Right? It's always going to be defined by in the context of, well, how's this lover compared to these other lovers that I've had? Well, I really like that. This person's that, and that person's this. And everyone knows that's going on. So even in the acts of sex, the emotional intimacy piece of it is gone because you can't really let your guard down and enjoy it because you're too busy thinking about, am I making a good impression, and how am I going to compare to that ex-boyfriend or that ex-girlfriend?
Right.
And it completely robs the joy from the act. All right. So it also leads to bizarre and damaging double standards. So I've stated a couple of them here for you guys to just think about. Number one, here's the double standard. Society would tell you that a woman's value is not connected in any way to her as a sexual being. Right, we hear about this all the time. Doesn't matter if you're fat, doesn't matter if you're skinny, doesn't matter if you're ugly, doesn't matter if you're pretty. None of that matters. As a woman, I am woman, hear me roar.
Be who you are.
And you just be who you are,
yourself.
and that's amazing.
Yep.
I can tell you where this comes in. So there was a whole line, and I might still be running, of Dove shampoo or body wash commercials,
soap,
where they made a big press release deal about it, and it was going to be women that were not models,
real women, all sorts of different shapes, sizes, colors.
Right, doesn't matter because these are what real women look like. Hold that thought for just a second. Here's the second half of the damaging double standard: that a woman's value is completely connected to how desirable she is sexually.
Yeah.
Now you might be going, well, how do those two things? Well, here's the problem. Go look at the magazine racks, watch the Amazon Prime shows, watch Netflix, look at the ads that pop up on your computer. Very rarely are they anything but supermodels selling stuff, and in generally very little clothing, and proportioned in a way to make them desirable for sex.
Yeah, and airbrushed and photoshopped and all that.
Right. So while that's not society, the first one, that your value is not connected in any way, that's a direct messaging that people are verbalizing, right? The second one is the double standard message, where no one's coming out and saying, hey, honey, your value really is tied to how good you are in the sack and how good you look. But
that's the expectation.
But that's the expectation because our daughters grow up going, man, how come every girl on the cover of a magazine is really pretty and has her shirt open the first 4 buttons? Right? And it sends a message to our young women that is your role, to look desirable and hold yourself out as a sexual object.
And the covers of some of these fashion, that's a loose term, magazines, is about sex, how to blow his mind, and how to do, the 10 new sex positions and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and lest you think Andrea and I are not hip with the kids, it's the same thing on TikTok and Twitter and all the rest. I mean, constantly I get these stupid ads that pop up for TikTok where they're saying, learn a new hobby. And it's a girl in a tight shirt and yoga pants doing yoga, downward dog, faced the other direction so that you can just see her legs and her butt. Okay. So you're telling me of all the videos on TikTok, the TikTok marketing team went, just grab whatever, that guy mowing the yard, that girl feeding her dog, or the girl doing yoga. Whatever, just throw something out there. I mean, do we really think that? Are we that stupid as people? Of course we're not. I mean, sex sells. And inherent in that is telling women that your value is to be a sex object.
Yep.
So take back to the Dove commercial for a minute. The Dove commercials rolled out. It was normal, everyday women, ladies, which is great. Mostly naked, washing their bodies with body wash. I mean, do we not see the double standard inherent in that commercial? Because I got something for you, ladies. Yes, there might be one body type that's preferred over another, but the body type that's preferred most is the naked one. So, I don't care who you are. If you're presenting women as, hey, here's naked women, you're doing the same thing. Right? So that's the double standard in one commercial. Yeah. Right? Women, it doesn't matter what you look like, long as you're mostly naked. Right. Which is insane. And it's problematic. Very problematic. Undermines sex and God's design for it. The second one, we won't belabor it as I fall behind time hopelessly. The first part is that society is more and more about making sex seem adventurous and exciting and appealing and desirable. No matter what, makes sex look amazing. Yep. Right? You never really see that sex scene where it's like missionary style and then she goes, no, could you get off me because I got to finish my grocery list. Right? I mean, that's not a thing. Right? It's crazy and awesome and intense and all that. So there's that. We're obsessed with displaying sex in that way, pornography included. And then second is that society cannot seem to understand why. The media, the news and the newspapers and all the rest can't seem to understand why a larger and larger percentage of men and women are acting out sexually in ways that we would say are manipulative and wrong. And violent. Oftentimes, at the very least, sexually violent. And we go, man, I just don't know why this number seems to keep growing and seems to be getting younger and younger and younger.
We're creating...
That's exactly right.
We're creating sexual predators. We've talked about that.
Right.
We're creating sexual deviants.
Right. That's exactly right.
We're creating people who are obsessed with sex.
Right. That's right. Because we've told people your entire identity and existence is wrapped up in sex. And it's not. All right. Third, society would say that a man's desire for sex is disgusting and wrong. There's a lot of political and social aspects that get wrapped up into this, but it's one of, I believe, the most damaging societal lies about sex, because what it creates is a whole bunch of sexually repressed guys who want to fit in and want to be a part of this new society that we're creating. But the problem is they have a desire for sex that they were created with by a loving God who gave us sex as a gift for us to explore and enjoy within the covenant of marriage. And the problem is society has completely done away with the idea that sex should be done solely within the confines of covenant marriage. And then on the other side have said, oh, and also, guys, the fact that you think about sex all the time is gross. Well, at some point, don't we have to go, well, right, guys think about sex all the time in 2021, and we do think about sex quite a bit. I was reading some studies earlier today psychologically about how often guys think of sex.
Oh, boy. Every 3 seconds.
A lot. But 3 to 5. It was
I
3 to 5 seconds.
I thought it was something like 3 seconds, yeah.
But
that's crazy.
Interestingly, interestingly, that's not changed over the last 100 years that they've been doing this study. And their projections are that if you went back 1,000 years, it would be the same.
Sure.
Because it doesn't seem to matter if the person that they test is Amish, Muslim, Christian, atheist, doesn't matter. We all, as guys, tend to have similar thought patterns. Now, the things that we think about change dramatically depending upon religion, background, etc., etc. But just having those sexual thoughts is on a consistency throughout. So at some point, don't you have to go, man, it seems like maybe guys just are this way.
Yeah.
Right? And for us, I would say are created this way. If you don't believe in God, then evolutionary-wise, they seem to be that way. The point is, it's hard to argue with the studies that we have that this is a nurture thing. Because for a long time, in all different sets of circumstances, it seems to be the same. So when we look at that, we have to recognize, and ladies, you need to recognize that a man's desire for sex is a part of who he is. Now, can that ever be taken out in a way that's predatory or me-focused? Absolutely not. And we're going to get to that in a minute, but I want to be super clear about that. This is not me saying, guys have needs. Right? I'm not saying
Sure.
that. What I am saying is, your husband's desire for sex is a beautiful thing because it was created by a loving and sovereign God. And part of the plight of a woman is to understand and appreciate
as much as
that
possible.
Man's desire for sex as much as possible. That's right. And women, I know for a lot of you, that's going to be a lifelong process, and it's going to be a lot of frustration of why whenever you walk by, he only seems to pat you on the butt or on the boob.
What?
I was reading an article earlier today. It was by a Christian psychologist, and she said she had a patient someone she was counseling, who said, my husband always makes a point when I get out of the shower of walking up and putting his arms around me and giving me a hug and kissing my neck. And she's like, a lot of times that turns into sex. And she's like, that's fine. And then she said, but I wish my husband would just walk up when I'm naked and put his arms around me and tell me what a good mother I am. And this psychologist, who was a woman, empathized with her, but she also said, sweetie, that's probably never going to happen. Because in that moment, he doesn't want to think about your children.
Yeah.
And it's because we're visual as men. We do have a strong desire for that. And darn it, you can't miss a moment when your wife's naked out of the shower. And so, look, guys, should we be better about that? Yes, we need to be better in that area. But as part of a marriage where we're directed by Paul, husbands, your bodies are your wives, and wives, your bodies are your husbands. A big part of that is wives recognizing, man, I might not have the body that I want, but I've got the body that he wants. And what a position of privilege you're able to be in to have that kind of control over your husband. Because I guarantee you, it doesn't matter what he's doing. When you go into your bedroom and you strip down to put your pajamas on, he's watching and hoping.
I think Nathan's talking to me right now.
This is coming from a friend. I was talking to a friend. No, but it is a beautiful thing, and I know this is an area where men and women have a lot of friction because women don't understand that,
and they don't want to be
a
sexual beings all the time.
Right, but I'm not saying that like too bad, just deal with it. But I am saying changing. It's like when we talk about thankfulness, changing your focus from it's frustrating that he just sees me as a big boob sometimes to
in a good way.
Right, in a good way. Yes, right, in a good way. Changing that to, man, what an amazing thing that I am everything sexually and physically for this guy.
Yeah.
And what a privilege that is
Yes,
for
right.
our wives. Okay, number 2, that sex before marriage is an important part of a strong relationship, or the converse of that, that sex after marriage is going to be boring and unfulfilling.
Yeah, that's like the world's lie.
Right, so the sex before marriage is, what's the analogy? I always get it wrong. If you're going to buy a sports car, you got to test drive it before you buy it.
Right.
I think that's the analogy. Guys, this has got to stop. I mean, the issue with this is, in that sentence, we're taking sex and trivializing it even in that sentence. Right? I mean,
Right.
a lot of people, I've done this, where you just go test drive a car you have zero interest in driving because you were really interested in just driving that particular car one time.
Yep.
Right? Like you go into the dealership and go, yeah, that Mustang convertible, yeah, I'm thinking about buying one of those. I probably better take it for a test drive. And then you drive it around and go, oh,
Nice.
I forgot I'm broke. Right? I mean,
I'm not actually interested in this. Yeah.
That's right. So even in that sentence, it trivializes what sex is designed to be. Now, the other side of that, guys, sex after marriage should not be boring.
Most of the time.
If it is boring, but I'm talking about as a whole.
I know.
If it is boring, y'all need to step your game up.
Yeah.
And start sitting down and I'm talking about outside of the bedroom. Have some conversation about what would really rev your engine. See, I can use a sports car analogy too, even after marriage. What would really get you going? See, a lot of people don't talk about this, right? And it makes it, and again, to me, this is a direct result of us trivializing sex before marriage. Then you get into marriage, and if you know that your husband or wife had sexual partners previously, it's like, well, they probably just know then because they've had sex before.
Yeah.
So then you get into bed and it doesn't go well. And unlike the couple that hasn't had sex before where it doesn't go well and they both go, first timer. Right?
Yeah,
and then you
I guess we'll figure that out.
Right, and then you talk about
Check
it.
that one off the list.
Right, you talk about it and you go, what if we tried this? Well, what if are you even allowed to put your there? And you you talk through it, and there's no shame because you're not going to say something and they're going to go, yeah, but my ex-boyfriend did that and it really made me feel bad. And then the person goes, oh crap, now I reminded her of her ex-boyfriend, and
now she's gonna be thinking about it if I try that.
And this thing, but I'd really like to try that, but I don't want to try it, so I'm just not going to say anything. And now there's things I desire that are going unfulfilled because I just don't want to bring them up and remind her of the ex-boyfriend. Does that sound naked and unashamed?
Right.
Right? That sounds like I want to put more clothes on and never talk again about it.
Yes.
That's the opposite.
Right.
And so for us as couples, you got to just jump in. And if you had sex before you were married, it's probably going to be a little awkward because there's probably going to be times when previous sexual relationships come up because you're talking openly about sex. And there's just going to have to be an opportunity for us to show the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ to our spouse.
Yep.
Where we say, hey, that's uncomfortable, but I love you, and let's push through this because I want our sexual relationship to be naked and unashamed from start to finish.
Yeah, and really choosing too that if you feel like there's a connection there with somebody that you've had some sort of intimate relationship with, choosing to get into that with the Lord.
Yep.
And cut that what we call a soul tie, but choosing to say, all right, God, I feel like there's still a connection there, and I need to cut that off.
Yeah.
You may not even have conversation with that person, but I feel like there's still something holding on, some connection, a tie there, whatever, and we need a deal on that.
Right, so we're going to talk not next week but the following week specifically about soul ties.
Yeah, good.
So if you kind of listen to that and you went, wait, what is this? What are we talking about? 2 weeks from today, we're going to dig into that specifically.
So the interesting thing about this number 2 that you're saying is I've heard this places and it seems so true. The enemy, Satan, seems dead set on getting us into bed as often as possible before marriage and getting us and keeping us from getting into bed as often as possible when we are married
to
each other.
Yeah, that's right.
So know that the enemy, yeah, that's his. I mean, the world of sex is a playground for him to manipulate and to bring in sin
Yep.
and get us all sorts of wayward with
Yep.
the Lord's plan. And so, of course, the Satan is wanting to have us have as many sexual experiences before marriage, and then make it something that doesn't work well and is awkward and shameful and not enjoyable or whatever that is when you're in marriage.
Exactly.
And
Right.
that goes into your sex before marriage is important, is the way the world thinks that sex
Right.
before marriage is an important part of a strong relationship, and that sex after marriage is boring and unfulfilling.
Right. It also is a leading factor as to why people pursue affairs.
Yeah.
Because your sex within marriage is boring becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because everybody goes, well, we knew it was going to be boring after we got married, and now that it is, why even bother? Because it's boring. And the problem is then sex with somebody new starts to look attractive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, number one reason. Thanks for hanging with us if you made it to this point. Number one thing that society gets wrong about sex, and the church is just right there with it, is that sex is about personal gratification. It is foundationally not. Mm-hmm. And if you want to be... Well, let me put this in the positive. Okay? Let me just bring the microphone over here. So, don't tell Andrea. But I'll give you the key. Not that I'm an amazing lover, but I'll give you the key to being an amazing lover, and I know it's the key because the Bible talks about it. If you want to be an amazing lover, focus fully and completely on any and all things that are not you. Got that? So, when you start having sex, your focus should be on... I warned you about having kids in the room. Your focus should be on bringing the other person an orgasm and sexual fulfillment, and not on getting yours. That's how you be an amazing lover. And again, I know that because we just had a side conversation there.
I had that.
Deal.
It was like that Zach Morris pause moment.
Yeah, it was. Time out.
Time out. That's what it was.
We should have done that and said time out, and you could have like frozen right where people would have been freaking out.
We ruined that.
I mean, speaking of things that trivialized sex, Saved by the Bell.
What?
Yeah, we know.
I don't remember
that. So, sorry, I was about to have another timeout. So seriously though, sex is about bringing fulfillment, bringing joy, bringing physical pleasure to your sexual partner, i.e. your spouse or your husband or wife, and not yourself. Now, look, that doesn't mean that sometimes you engage in activities where one or the other party has an orgasm and you don't, and then you go, well, that was a sin, right? That's not what I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about is...
It's a heart attitude.
That's right. As a husband or a wife, your focus should be on your spouse, not just in sex, but especially in sex. Because your husband or wife is in a position where they're completely vulnerable to you. Mm-hmm. And there's just no way to hide if you're making sex ultimately about yourself. And when you do that, it feels like a betrayal. And I know that because all people walking around the earth that have been in bad sexual relationships, and almost all of them cite as a primary reason for the pain that they've received from that relationship, I felt like it was all about them.
Yeah, or I felt used. Same thing.
I felt used, right.
Yeah.
Felt objectified, felt like all they wanted was my body, whatever. And all those are code words for is sex was really all about them getting theirs. Mm-hmm. And it's destructive. But that's what society says, right? Hey, it's about, you hook up and, you want to get yours, right? And even to go back to some of those articles you were talking about with regards to women, it's still self-focused from the standpoint of, top 10 ways to blow his mind. That sounds others focused, but most of the time when you read those articles, it starts with something like, are you concerned about losing your man? Want to make sure he stays true to you for all time?
Right.
Well, here's 10 tips for
Sex
blind
is the way to
blowing
do that.
sex.
Yeah.
That's right. It's weaponizing sex by creating it as a tool of control. Go back to Genesis 3. That was the curse on women. Is that in that case it was husbands to wives, as it should be with regards to sex. But what it said is the wife Eve will desire control over her husband, but he will be in control over her. Well, one of the most surefire ways that a wife can control her husband is through the sex spigot, right? You do the things.
Good to know.
You do the things. Sorry, I should have done a timeout right there. No, you turn the spigot up if he's being a good little boy, and you turn it down if he's being a naughty little boy, and then you're like the sexual Santa Claus in your marriage, and it's incredibly destructive, and will absolutely lead to an unfulfilling marriage for you as the wife, because he will resent you, and you will either, best case, you will become roommates. Worst case, he'll get the side action or whatever, because you're manipulating him and he knows it, and men hate to be manipulated. So this whole idea that sex is about personal gratification is, it's incredibly destructive. And it's, for me, the number one way that society gets marriage wrong. So to just read those back through real quick for you to think about this week. Top 5 ways that we believe that society around us gets sex wrong. They trivialize sex. Society teaches that your identity is wrapped up in sex. Society teaches that a man's desire for sex is disgusting and wrong. Society teaches that sex before marriage is an important part of a strong relationship, and that sex after marriage is going to be boring and unfulfilling. And society holds that sex is really, at the end of the day, about personal gratification. Those 5 things are directly refuted by the Bible. Love to have you go back and listen to last week's episode where we talk about what sex is, and it will become very apparent beyond our discussion this morning about why those things are wrong. Any closing remarks, babe?
That was great stuff.
Thanks for being here with me.
Yeah.
All right. Guys, really appreciate you being here. Please join us Thursday morning for Family Friday. Andrea is going to be sharing some pretty intimate details, transparent details about how the Lord's kind of spoken to her and what he's been doing in her life very recently. And I can't wait for her to share that with you and with me, because I've not heard the whole story. So it'll be great. All right, guys, thank you again so much for joining us. As always, we'd love to have your comments in as part of the conversation. Hope that you spend some time thinking and talking with your spouse, if you're married, or your significant other, if you're not married, about sex and about these things that we talked about here, and how we can protect ourselves in our marriage from allowing these things to creep in. So until next Monday, when we talk about sex and the do's and don'ts within marriage, guys, remember, God is for your marriage. Have a great week.
Hey, thanks for joining us on Marriage by Design. If you were impacted by this video, like it by hitting the thumbs up below. Also, don't forget to subscribe, and once you subscribe, hit the bell icon so you can be notified when new episodes release.
Excellent. Also, one of the huge pillars of our show is interactivity between us and you. So we would love you to comment down in the comments below if you have thoughts about this video, or if you have questions or other things you'd like to see considered in the future. In addition, if you'd like, you can email us. That's marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram @marriagebydesignpodcast, or you can find us on Facebook by searching Marriage by Design Podcast. Finally, if you want to, you can tweet at us. We do have a Twitter account that is @MarriageXDesign. Thanks, and have a great day.